You know it and you love it, but did you realize who was responsible for bringing macaroni and cheese into your life? Learn about James Hemings, the enslaved man who traveled to France and trained in French cuisine, this week on Footnoting History. Hello, Footnoting History friends. It's Kristin here to make sure you know all the important historical stuff. And if you're listening to this episode around release day, to bring you a little Thanksgiving pregame. Today, we're talking macaroni and cheese. And I wasn't kidding. This is important historical stuff. Mac and cheese is one of the most delightful culinary contributions to our world, and one that is a frequent star at the American Thanksgiving table, including my own. And you have James Hemings to thank for that. Before I tell you about James Hemings, or as much about him as we know, remember that you can find a captioned version of this episode on our website, footnotinghistory.com, as well as on our YouTube channel. And if you'd like to read more about James, you can find a list of further reading on our website, footnotinghistory.com. Also, true to Kristin form, before I tell you what we know about James Hemings and how he brought mac and cheese to the table, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we know what we know, which is complicated because James Hemings was enslaved, and as a general matter, historians do not know nearly enough about the backgrounds and lives of enslaved people because the institution of slavery bypassed the personhood of the enslaved and treated them as commodities and numbers rather than individuals. James and his family, the Hemingses, are a little different, and in fact, historians know more about them than many free white people in the 18th and early 19th century Virginia where they lived. The information is still not as fulsome as we would like, but we do have some information, and a lot of that information comes to us from documents that detail James Hemings's ownership. The person who wrote those documents wrote a lot of stuff, some of which you may be particularly familiar with if you're a student of American history. And that guy was Thomas Jefferson, who was just prolific in writing down all kinds of stuff. Annette Gordon Reed, whose book The Hemingses of Monticello, which I highly recommend, and there are also clips of her talking about James on the Monticello website. Gordon Reed talks about sitting down with one of the main sources on the Hemingses, Thomas Jefferson's farm book, written by Jefferson between 1774 and 1824, and now held at the Massachusetts Historical Society. The farm book is basically what it sounds like. It's a very detailed record of the agricultural operations on Jefferson's various properties, the most famous of which is the plantation of Monticello, which is about 70 miles northwest of Richmond, Virginia. And before I go on, I will say that I am pronouncing it Monticello and not Monticello, because that is what the Monticello website says it's supposed to be. Apparently, there was some confusion in the 1960s when NBC released its pronunciation manual and decided it was supposed to be Cell, not Chell, but Chell was how Jefferson pronounced it, so Monticello it is. The farm book was about what and how much was being produced and the livestock and the enslaved people who ran the plantations and farms. The farm book isn't the only mention of the Hemingses, and not the only mention by Jefferson, but it's a significant source. Jefferson also wrote a lot of letters that talked about the Hemingses. We also have the memoirs of Madison Hemings, who was James's nephew, and a lot of oral histories from people who lived at Monticello and knew the people there as well. And certainly people outside of Monticello were aware of the family and wrote about them. There are also a small number of surviving recipes that James Hemings wrote. Sally Hemings is probably the Hemings you think of first in the context of Thomas Jefferson and the Hemings family, if you have heard of them. And she was James Hemings's younger sister. You might be familiar with her story, or you may not, but it does provide some important context to James's story, so I'll give you a brief overview. Sally was born into slavery around 1773 on a Virginia plantation called the Forest that was owned by a man named John Wales, who historians believe was Sally's father. Sally's mother, Elizabeth, also called Betty, was born sometime in the 1730s to an African mother and an English father, who was the captain of a trading vessel. Because Betty's mother was enslaved, so too was her daughter and any other children she might have. John Wales would not sell Betty to her father, though her father father did try. Likely this captain's last name was Hemings. He acknowledged that Betty was his, though he didn't have a legal claim to her. He still gave her his name, and that's where the last name Hemings comes from. We do not know what Betty's mother's name was. John Wales would go on to father 6 children with Betty, one of whom was Sally and another of whom was James. Sally was the youngest of Elizabeth and John's children, born in 1773. James was their second oldest child, born in 1765. John Wales was Thomas Jefferson's father-in-law. When Wales died, Thomas Jefferson, by way of his wife Martha, inherited the Hemingses, other enslaved people, and other property. That was a horrible sentence to say, but that's what happened. People were talking about Tom and Sally as early as the 1790s and their quote-unquote relationship, and there is much debate about whether we can even call it that. Their relationship was brought up in the presidential campaign in the early 1800s because Jefferson's political opponents thought that would work against him. Spoiler, it didn't. People still called Sally and her family awful things in the press, but Sally didn't actually say anything publicly that we know about, nor did her family. What we do know is this. Sally went to Paris to work in Jefferson's household in 1787 when he was the U.S. minister to France when she was 14 years old and he was 44. Sally was supposed to be there as a maid for Jefferson's daughters, but he initiated a sexual relationship with Sally, and when it was time to go home in 1789, she was pregnant. Slavery was not legal in France at that time. The French weren't exactly against the enslavement of others. There was still slavery in the French colonies in the Caribbean, but in Paris, Sally was free, and it seems she did not want to go back to Virginia. Jefferson convinced her to go back. Madison Hemings talks about how he promised her, quote, extraordinary privileges, and also promised to free all her children when they turned 21, which he did do. Sally and Tom had a sexual relationship for decades after they returned from France. There has been much written on the nature and the consensual aspect of this relationship that is certainly interesting, but not really the focus here today. So I encourage you to head to the further reading for directions to go if you're so interested. I am a professionally trained historian. I get the idea of placing people in their historical context and how people are complicated. They can do both good and bad things. Like, I get it. Gordon Reed has a good section in her book about how older men and much younger women pairing up was far more acceptable then than it is today. Still, I read all this 44-year-old man and a 14-year-old girl of wildly different social statuses and powers, and just, no. Jefferson, no. Also in France around this time, right before the French Revolution, was Sally's brother James, who was training in French cuisine so Jefferson could do more fancy European living back in America. Jefferson was enamored with all things European, the architecture, the culture, the food. He had ideas for how he wanted Monticello to be. And James Hemings would be an integral part of how that transformation would happen. James moved to Monticello in 1773 when he was 8 years old when John Wales died. But before Wales died, Jefferson visited and was in contact with the Hemings children and singled them out for special treatment. According to the Monticello website, the first mention we have of James by Jefferson is when James sold him a mockingbird. When Wales died and the Hemings boys came to Monticello, they got special privileges, like being able to travel around on their own. They got to learn trades, and they were allowed to hire themselves out and keep their wages. Many of the Hemings boys grew up to be artisans who were the carpenters and skilled workers of Monticello and built what you see today. They were not working in the fields, nor were the Hemings women. In 1781, James and his brother Robert were working as valets for Jefferson while he was in Williamsburg, and then in Richmond when Jefferson was the wartime governor of Virginia. Of course, people wonder why Jefferson singled out the Hemingses, and there has been a lot written on that too. Most theories have to do with the mixed race of the family and how their lineage caused people to view them differently, more capable, more intelligent than other people of African descent. And though they were enslaved and definitely not viewed as equal, they were still sort of part of this larger Wales family. When Jefferson was first appointed Commerce Minister by George Washington in 1784, and when Jefferson went to Paris, 19-year-old James went with him to train in French cuisine. Jefferson was really into this idea of James, who had worked in the kitchens in Monticello and who must have shown some talent for cooking, learning how to make fancy French food, but it's kind of a mystery as to why. Thomas Cromwell, whose book is listed in the further reading, doesn't think that Jefferson had ever even tasted French cuisine before he got to Paris. There were no French chefs in Virginia, and while there were perhaps French immigrants around, and there were certainly French military officers helping during the American Revolution, it doesn't seem like Jefferson knew exactly why he wanted what he wanted, except Jefferson was just a generally curious person, and that French cooking had a reputation for being exciting and varied and finely executed. And I guess he was going anyway, so why not? Also, Jefferson was a people pleaser. Many historians have written about how he loved to be loved, and he loved entertaining people. People often didn't like him right away, but spend a few minutes with him and he felt like your best friend. He was constantly hosting dinners at Monticello and his other properties. He put in a large kitchen at Monticello in 1770, which, fun fact, was turned into visitor bathrooms in the 1960s because no one thought the kitchen would be interesting to people. Don't worry, they fixed that. It's restored now. The original kitchen included gardens where Jefferson directed plants to be grown that he imported from Europe and Mexico. He did order fig plants from France. He also had orchards and vineyards. He tried to grow European vine varieties, the Vitis vinifera, which is grown in France, but not exclusively in France, but it didn't work out. He tried American varieties too, but Monticello wine was not winning any awards. Jefferson, his older daughter Patsy, and James left for Paris in July of 1784 and arrived in Paris in August. They were supposed to be staying at the Hôtel d'Orléans, but there were actually two places with that name in Paris, and they ended up at the wrong one first. John Adams and Ben Franklin were also there at the correct Hôtel d'Orléans in the left bank, where Jefferson and James eventually moved. Patsy was a part-timer and went to school at an abbey during the week. Polly, the younger daughter, would go there too when she came a little later. Eventually, the Jefferson household moved to another residence on the Champs-Élysées, which was a happening place to be in the 18th century and must have been very exciting, if not overwhelming at first, for a person who hadn't traveled much in his life, meaning James. Jefferson had no real plan for James learning how to cook French cuisine before leaving America for France, but when they got there, he started looking around for somewhere for James to apprentice and eventually found a restaurateur and caterer named Monsieur Combeau, who charged 150 francs to teach James the culinary ropes, the details of which we don't unfortunately know much about, but we do know that James was with Combeau for many months. He also worked in the household of the Prince de Condé, who charged a lot more than Combeau, where, among other things, he learned how to make French pastry, which is definitely not easy. We do know that James learned French, and he spoke it better than Jefferson did. I find it endlessly amusing that Thomas Jefferson thought he spoke French, and maybe he technically knew it, but the guy who taught him had a thick Scottish accent, and so when he got to Paris, no one could understand what he was saying, and he didn't seem to ever really speak French well. James got the hang of it pretty quick, though. I mean, he kind of had to, but learning a new language is not easy, and there is a lot of evidence that James was a proficient French speaker. He was also certainly aware that in France, he was a free man, and he encountered other free Black men and women in Paris. James Hemings had freedom of movement in Paris, and he was pulling a wage, and he hired a tutor in 1787 to learn French better, so maybe he was thinking of staying. And that's maybe why Jefferson eventually agreed to emancipate James. If he taught someone else of Jefferson's choosing what he learned in France, someone who could take his place back in America. The written agreement from Jefferson comes after their return to America, but there was maybe some discussion to that effect before the Jefferson Hemings crew left Paris. A lot of people have done a lot of wondering, including me, why James, or Sally for that matter, agreed to return with Jefferson to places where slavery was legal when they were free in France, and they only had the unenforceable promises of Jefferson to either free them or their children. It's something of a mystery, and neither James nor Sally ever really said We can imagine that they truly believed Jefferson. He treated them, quote unquote, well, minus the enslavement part. But Jefferson did tend to keep enslaved families together, and he did favor the Hemingses. So when you're weighing your realistic options, that probably factored in. Maybe they just wanted to believe Jefferson because France wasn't looking so good in 1789. There was still a lot of social and racial hurdles that were difficult, if not impossible, to surpass. And the rest of their family was back in Virginia, but we don't really know. And while we also don't know exactly what Combeau and de Condé's chef were teaching James in their kitchens, we do have written evidence of what French cuisine was like around this time, notably a multi-volume cookbook called Les Dons de Comus, The Gifts of Comus, written in 1739 by François Mérin. He was a big deal Parisian chef who was writing for a bourgeoisie audience, so not the nobility, but people who were wealthy enough to want to eat like the nobility, kind of describes Jefferson. The books were super popular and had a lot of later reprintings, and you can read versions of the work online if you're curious. There's lots of really interesting stuff in it, but for our purposes, it's important to know that it's full of sauces like bechamel, which is a base of butter and flour cooked together with the addition of milk. Fancy French chefs and Top Chef wannabes call this a roux. James knocked his apprenticeship out of the park, and he eventually became the head chef at Jefferson's Paris house in 1787, which was the same year that Sally headed over to join the household with Jefferson's younger daughter. Jefferson was a big deal American diplomat, and he was entertaining lots of important and wealthy and culinarily discerning people, of which he was one. And James had his work cut out for him. But he did a great job. People seemed to really enjoy his work and probably missed him when he returned to America in 1789. Back in America, James was installed as the head chef at Jefferson's New York and later Philadelphia residences. There was a big famous dinner in New York, which was at that time the temporary capital, and later Jefferson described that evening as the meal, quote, to save the Union, because at the end of the night, Alexander Hamilton agreed to make Washington, D.C. the capital if James Madison would agree to the federal government taking on the debt of the states. The food was that good, I guess. Then the capital moved again to Philadelphia, and James was there too, cooking for all the big deal Americans and whoever they were trying to impress. Philadelphia must have been interesting to James. If an enslaved person was in Philadelphia for 6 months, he could have claimed his freedom. That was according to the 1780 Pennsylvania Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery. James was there long enough, but he didn't file for freedom. When Jefferson resigned as Secretary of State in 1793 and was preparing to return to Monticello, that's when we get the written evidence about Jefferson's agreement to eventually free James and the terms of that freedom. James was freed in 1796, but before that moment happened, he trained his brother Peter, and James's culinary legacy endured. So also shout out to Peter Hemings, because he was also doing an amazing job as a chef at Monticello. We can't know how Peter felt about training to be James's replacement when James was about to be freed, and he wasn't. Peter would be emancipated when he was in his 50s, but that was a long way off at this point. But Peter apparently mastered the art of French cuisine and cooked as well as James, or enough so that James was granted his freedom. James really revolutionized the kitchens and the cuisine at Monticello. Culinary historian and author of the food blog Afro Culinaria, James Twitty, talks about the stove that James had built upon his return. And it's this French-German-English hybrid of a beast, and you can see the archaeological remains of it on the Monticello website. It was the French aspects of the stove, though, that were really groundbreaking for how food got made. It was charcoal fueled and had grates on it, and you could move pots around on the grates according to how hot you needed things to be, and you could lower the grates or raise them as you needed. Kind of like cooking with a charcoal grill today, but really amped up. And then there was the food that came out of this jazzed up kitchen and beyond. In 1824, a man named Daniel Webster wrote about dining at Monticello and called the food half Virginian and half French. Half Virginian, half French seems to mean American ingredients like corn and squash and stuff like that, prepared with those delicate French sauces. I mean, it sounds pretty good. But macaroni and cheese is arguably James Hemings's most lasting imprint on American cuisine, and dare I say, one of the greatest gifts humanity has ever received. In the 18th century, macaroni was a catch-all term for any kind of pasta. It wasn't just the elbow shape we know today. The word is derived from the Italian word macaroni. Please enjoy my terrible Italian accent. This was a generic name for types of tube-shaped pasta made from durum wheat. So think rigatoni and penne, that could fit here too. American colonists definitely knew about and made pasta, and cookbooks have recipes for it by the mid-1700s. And Jefferson became well acquainted with pasta while he was in France. And while the pasta was Italian in origin, it was used in French cuisine. And there were occasions when Jefferson was traveling all around France and even made it into Italy. I bet he ate pasta there too. Jefferson loved pasta, and so James was making it. Jefferson had a, quote, mold for making macaroni made in anticipation of his departure from France, and later imported pasta and Parmesan cheese when he got back home. And Jefferson was buying pounds of macaroni right up to the moment he died. We only have 4 surviving recipes that James Hemings wrote down himself, and yes, he was literate. They're for snow eggs, chocolate, tea, and coffee creams. Snow eggs are a very French thing. They're meringues poached in a vanilla custard sauce, and yes, please, all of these recipes sound delicious, but none of them, unfortunately, are mac and cheese. Many people have tried to recreate James's mac and cheese, and while we don't have a specific recipe that he wrote, we have an idea. There is a recipe written down by Jefferson and held now at the Library of Congress for macaroni. It's, quote, 6 eggs, yolks and whites, 2 wine glasses of milk, 2 tablespoons of flour, a little salt. Work them together without water and very well. Roll it then with a roller to a paper thickness. Cut it into small pieces, which roll again with the hand into long slips, and then cut them into a proper length. Put them into warm water a quarter of an hour, drain them, dress them as macaroni. But if they're intended for soups, they are to be put into the soup and not into warm water. So that gets you some of the way there, and the dressing as macaroni is the room for the cheese and the butter. The recipe doesn't cite its originating source and is undated, but historians think Jefferson wrote it down sometime in 1789 before he left France. And, Jefferson wasn't the one at the stove, that was James. If Jefferson wrote this down, he wanted to eat it, and James was going to make it. According to food historian Lenny Sorensen, our mac and cheese of today comes from James's macaroni pie, which was something often served at Jefferson's table. In this dish, you cook the noodles until tender in a mix of water and milk. A lot of mac and cheese recipes today do it this way. In this version, you drain the noodles and then you layer the pasta in a dish with butter and then layers of shredded cheese. The layering of a starch with butter and cheese is a very French technique, and if you've ever had gratin potatoes, you'll be familiar with that deliciousness. Julia Child's famous gratin dauphinois is a classic, and it's basically the same thing here. The milk has a different application, but just sub potatoes for pasta and add in some garlic, and there you go. Gratin dauphinois is first mentioned in writing in France in 1788, but the good historian in you knows that it was probably around earlier than that, and James was in France in 1788. The actual written recipe that Sorensen seems to be following is very similar to the one that appears in Mary Randolph's cookbook, The Virginia Housewife, which was published in 1824, but very likely was inspired by the Hemings spin on a macaroni dish that had become quite popular already. When Jefferson became president in March of 1801, he kept throwing his dinner parties and impressing people with menus honed by James Hemings. Jefferson served a version of James's macaroni pie at a state dinner in the White House in 1802, and that's where it took off. Reverend Manasseh Cutler of Ohio wrote about being served a, quote, pie called macaroni at this White House dinner, and he actually didn't like it. And with a name like Reverend Manasseh Cutler, I can't say I'm surprised. He described it as, quote, rich crust filled with the strillions of onions or shallots, which I took it to be, tasted very strong and not very agreeable. Some things may be subjective, but the good Reverend was wrong, at least in the court of public opinion. Jefferson had this dish served a lot, and it became incredibly popular on tables around the country. James Hemings didn't invent putting pasta and cheese together, and we can't discount the possibility that Peter Hemings was adding his own flair to a dish he learned from James. But James was the teacher, and he did mac and cheese so well and with his own James Hemings twist, and with such a public platform that he really was behind the popularity of a a dish that remains beloved to this day. James, unfortunately, did not live happily ever after. His final years and his death in 1801 are terribly tragic. We don't really know where James went after 1796, though there is a comment by Jefferson in a letter to his daughter that suggests that James maybe went back to Paris. But if he did, he didn't stay. He was also back in Philadelphia for a time and was maybe thinking about going to Spain. He was working at a tavern in Baltimore in 1801, and in 1801, James Hemings died in Baltimore at the age of 36. A friend of Thomas Jefferson, William Evans, wrote to Jefferson that, quote, "The report respecting James Hemings having committed the act of suicide is true. The general opinion was that drinking too freely was the cause." But drinking wasn't the whole answer. There was something more behind that. James lived in a world that was not kind to him. He was separated from his family. He went back to Monticello to visit and for a short time to work again for Jefferson for a few months in 1801, but the family he came from was close and he wasn't with them. Virginia law said that an emancipated person had to leave the state. That, combined with just being a Black man in early America, had to be more difficult than I could possibly imagine. There is a lot that we, unfortunately, do not know about James Hemings, but we do know this. He was an incredibly smart and talented person who lived a very complicated and interesting and difficult life. He was really good at what he did, and the world is better off for having him in it. So thank you, James Hemings. Thank you. This has been Footnoting History. If you like the podcast, please like and subscribe and widen the nerd net by telling your friends. If you would like to help keep Footnoting History open access, please consider joining the ranks of our very dear and much appreciated Patreon and Ko-Fi communities. You can also purchase Footnoting History merch. Thank you for listening, and remember, the best stories are in the footnotes.